Hi, good morning. My name is Erin Lacey. You are attending Projecting Debt to Earning Rates this morning, or perhaps this afternoon, depending on where you're located. This is part of our Navigating Gainful Employment series, and this is the first in the 5-part series. This is actually a re-recording. This recording was originally, or this presentation was originally given in February 2016, and we determined to re-record it to improve the recording quality. We weren't happy with the quality of the original recording. That being said, the content is the same, so there's no distinction between the content that was delivered during the live webinar in February and the content being delivered today. Again, I started at the top, said my name is Erin Lacey. I'm a partner in the higher education practice of Thompson Coburn LLP. We are a law firm of about 400 attorneys. Our main location is in St. Louis, but we also have locations around the country in places like Washington, D.C. and Chicago and Los Angeles. Our higher education practice does a lot of things, but I tend to group them sort of in 3 buckets. First, we offer regulatory counsel on federal, state, accrediting agency laws and standards, all those types of regulatory frameworks that apply to post-secondary education, and that would include the federal financial aid programs under Title IV of the HEA, Title IX, CLARI Act, consumer information, the ADA, all those kinds of things. We also assist institutions with a wide range of transactions that can include merger and acquisition work, both in the for-profit and the nonprofit setting, conversions, a lot of commercial contract drafting, policy creation, and we help folks design compliance systems to comply with all of those regulations we talked about in the first bucket. And finally, we represent institutions. Sometimes things don't go the way you want them to, and you end up with student or employee litigation. We do quite a bit of that work, and we also represent folks and assist them when they're dealing still directly with agencies. So if you were going through a program review with the Department of Education, for example, or in some sort of dispute with your accreditor, we might assist. Before I was with Thompson & Coburn, just so that you know, I spent 4 years in-house with a post-secondary institution. I had 24 locations and an online division overseeing all of their regulatory and strategic development initiatives. So doing a lot of the kinds of things that the folks who are listening to this webinar likely do. And while I was in-house, Gainful Employment 2011 occurred. So I was with an institution going through that first round of reporting and developing disclosures, all of those types of things. And prior to that, I spent 8 years in another higher education practice with a law firm in Washington, D.C. So our outline today, the first thing I want to do is go through the GE timeline. We're going to do that in every one of these webinars. It's really important for folks to know what's coming so that you're prepared and have a chance to sort of prioritize and think about what you need to be doing next. There's a lot on the plate in the realm of GE, and so keeping priorities straight will be helpful because it will make you more efficient and more effective. The heart of the presentation, I'm going to give you an overview of the debt to earning rates briefly, and then we're really going to get into projecting the rates. And, you know, one of the things when I go around speaking and I chat with clients, it is my belief that before you can start talking about strategies for improving rates, challenging rates, disclosures, all of those kinds of things, the first thing you need to do is try to get a grip on how your programs are likely to perform. And the way to do that is to try to project or simulate the calculations the department's going to do for each of your programs. Optimally, you don't want to wait until the department is actually sending you their rates, because by that point, a lot of the options you've got for potentially, implementing strategies to improve your rates and other such things may have already passed. So you want to try to get a strong sense of where your rates are going to fall as early as possible. The other thing is, if you know how to project these rates and you know what type of debt to earning ratio is going to likely be passing, you can take that into account when you're developing new programs, whether that be specifically in response to gainful employment or just for the purpose of rolling out something new that you think will be enjoyed by students and effective for getting them jobs. But you need to understand the debt to earning ratio so that when you decide what the cost structure is for that program and the type of debt that they're likely to take on, you can be comfortable you won't run into issues under the new gainful employment regulations. Finally, I'm going to give you a handful of GE resources. So the gainful employment timeline, first 2015, this has already passed, right? But I just wanted to remind us of what we've already seen. So the new gainful employment regulations became effective last July. In July and then later in October, institutions were required to report a great deal of information for 7 or 8 award years. And then in November, for the first time, you had an opportunity, and still you have an opportunity, to go onto the department's website and set up an SAIG mailbox to receive completers lists and also to enroll in the department's new data challenges and appeal solution, which is going to be their new platform for challenging data. We talk in great detail about completers lists and completers list challenges and the department's new platform in the 3rd webinar in this series of 5. Right. But I just wanted to note today that institutions already have the opportunity to set up the SAIG mailbox to receive gainful employment information, including this completers list, and also to go ahead and register in the event they want to challenge any of this gainful employment information over the next year, so that they can do that through the new DCAS system. So I encourage schools, if you have not done this yet, to go ahead. It takes 30, 40 minutes to go on the department's website and set these things up, and you want to go ahead and do that. Finally, by December 31 of last year, everyone was required to complete their GE transitional certification for any gainful employment programs you offered. If you have not done that yet, I know the department is sending letters to folks trying to get them to do it, so I would say just get it done at this point. I haven't heard about anyone being subject to any sorts of sanctions, but the further time goes by and you haven't gotten that done, the more likely it is you're going to get some real heat. So I would go ahead, if you have not done that, and get it done. So this year, the big theme is going to be the challenges. Institutions are going to be receiving debt and earnings information from the department in different packages, and they will have opportunities through various means to challenge that information. Again, that's discussed in the 3rd webinar in this 5-part series. The first opportunity we expect will be this spring, although it looks like the timeline is already getting pushed back, so maybe it will be late spring or even early summer, and that is the completers list challenge I referenced a few moments ago. By summer, we would expect, or late summer, again, all of this happens sequentially, so if the first thing gets backed up, then everything else gets backed up as well. But, at some point after the completers list come out and those are challenged, the department will ultimately get around to calculating and distributing the draft DE rates for the first round of DE rates, which is the 14-15 award year rates. And at that point, institutions will begin to have an opportunity to challenge the loan debt information, draft loan debt information, and also the draft earnings information. So you'll have the loan debt challenges and the alternative earnings appeals that will go into play. All of that occurs this year, and is really the theme of 2016 from the perspective of gainful employment, is preparing for those challenges. And again, I mentioned a few moments ago, to really effectively challenge the data, you have to understand where it's coming from, and that's why it's important to go through the exercise we're going through today, which is deconstructing the rate calculations and understanding how to reconstruct and project rates for each of your GE programs. In 2017, you have in January the new GE disclosures become effective. We talk about that in the final of this 5-part series. That last webinar is all about the new disclosures. Also, we expect in 2017 the issuance of the final DE rates for the first round, right? That may get pushed back as well, but I would expect to see it by late spring. Institutions will still have an ongoing opportunity up to 60 days after the final rates are distributed to prepare and submit an alternative earnings appeal. So you have a very long multi-month window to prepare and submit alternative earnings appeals from the date the draft rates are released to 60 days after the final rates are released. But as we discussed in our 5th webinar, that appeals process is significant. Your alternative earnings appeal has to be certified by an independent auditor, et cetera. So it is something that will take a lot of time to pull together and package correctly for the department. And finally, after the DE rates come out, the final DE rates, if you have a program that fails year 1, then you will have to start making these student warning disclosures. The 4th webinar in our series discusses the student warning disclosures. All right, DE rates overview. So DE rates overview, which Title IV programs are gainful employment programs? pretty much all programs offered by for-profit institutions. If you're a for-profit, the likelihood that you offer a program that's not a gainful employment program is extraordinarily low. And almost all non-degree programs offered by any post-secondary institution. So you could even have large research universities that are offering graduate certificates. That is a non-degree program, right, or a non-degree, it leads to a non-degree credential, right? And so those programs, if the students are eligible for Title IV in that program, that is a covered GE program. Similarly, at community colleges where they offer a range of certificate programs, those are all gainful employment programs as well. It's not about just for-profit or nonprofit, right? So, and if you're interested, we have a law and policy blog called Regulation on our website, and I actually did a blog about, sort of why the gainful employment rules apply to certain kinds of programs and others and not others. But to keep it simple, if you're for-profit, it's pretty much every program you offer, and if you're a nonprofit or any other institution, it's any non-degree program you offer, again, that's Title IV eligible, any Title IV non-degree program. Additional information regarding the programs, like I say, I wrote about it on my blog. You can also check out Gainful Employment Electronic Announcement 53, What is a Gainful Employment Program, that was put out in May of 2015, and it gets into a little more detail if you have questions. So what are the DE rates that we're deconstructing and then reconstructing and projecting today? Okay, there are two. The first is the annual earnings rate. That is annual loan payment over annual earnings. And the second is the discretionary income rate, which is annual loan payment over discretionary income. You'll note that the numerator in both instances is the same, and the denominator, though different, I will tell you the discretionary income is essentially a slight riff on annual earnings. So once you learn how to calculate your annual earnings rate, you only need to do a slight additional calculation to calculate and project a discretionary income rate. Both of these rates are important. If you are an institution that expects to have a median debt for your program, for a given GE program, if it's less than about $15,000, so if you charge less than $15,000 for the whole program, or if the debt load people typically take on is less than $15,000, and we'll talk about cost and debt later, but if the median debt for the program is less than $15K, it's probably going to be the annual earnings rate that is your best bet. Once you get north of about $15,000 in debt/cost, the discretionary income rate is likely to be the rate that you will most easily be able to pass or make adjustments to pass. But both are important, and you're going to want to project both just to see exactly how your program plays out. The other thing to understand is it may differ program to program. So you may have one program where the median debt is $11,000 and another where the median debt is, a master's program where it's $45,000 or something like that, in which case for program one, your annual earnings rate may be what you're focused on, and for the second program, it may be your discretionary income rates, program by program consideration. What are the DE rate thresholds? So the pass, the AER, if it's less than or equal to 8%, or your DIR is less than or equal to 20%, then you would pass. There's this in-between place where you would be in what the department calls the zone, and that's what you see in the middle here. And then off to the right, if your annual earnings rate is greater than 12% and your discretionary income is greater than 30%, then the program would fail for a given year. And it's important to note that it is an and. You have to fail both rates for your program to actually fail. I've chatted with some folks subsequent to doing this webinar series, and some noted that that was a point of confusion, and it's really important to understand. So you have to fail both rates to actually fail. Now remember, there's a distinction between a program failing in a given year and losing eligibility. They are not one and the same. So a GE program becomes ineligible for Title IV if it fails 2 out of any 3 consecutive award years for which the program's rates are calculated, right? So if you fail in year 1, pass in year 2, fail in year 3, then the program becomes ineligible, right? And it becomes ineligible pretty much right away. I mean, the expectation is like other when institutions no longer meet other eligibility criteria, the moment you become ineligible, very shortly thereafter, you would expect to get something from the department cutting off Title IV, right? So it's not one of those things where if you fail and they calculate your rates in March, you have through the end of the award year or the end of the calendar year It's effective because you're no longer eligible, or the program, I should say, the GE program that has failed 2 out of 3 consecutive years would no longer be eligible more or less at the time the department determines and issues the final rate determination. So one way you become ineligible is you fail 2 out of any 3 consecutive award years. Another is if you have a combination of zone and failing rates for 4 consecutive award years, again, for which the program's rates are calculated. So you could have a situation where you were in the zone 2 or 3 years, and then if you passed a couple of years in a row, you would be in good shape. But if you have that combination of zone and failing for too long a period of time in consecutive years, then you can fail in that, you can become ineligible that way as well. The other sanction that I referenced earlier, and that's really important to understand, is the student warning sanction. So if a program fails, right, or if it is in the zone 3 years in a row, either way, at any point at which the program is a year out from potentially losing eligibility, then an institution has to start making these student warnings, right? So it's a consumer, it's sort of an odd way to say it, but it's a consumer protection concern. I mean, basically the department is saying, look, if you're a year away from potentially losing Title IV for this program, you need to let students know. They might be 2 years into a bachelor's program at that point, and they need to know that at the end of their junior year, they might lose federal aid, right? Again, I talk at length in the 4th webinar in this series about student warnings, because one of the things I want to make sure institutions understand, the warnings you have to make, it's canned language, it's pretty stern. You have to hand something to prospective and current students that says this program may not be eligible for Title IV a year from now. There are also timelines related to when you have to make the disclosure. There's a cooling period. For example, you have to make the disclosure and wait 3 days before the student can sign an enrollment agreement or register or pay you any money. All of that you need to think about and prepare to integrate into your admissions process if you know you've got a program that's going to fail, right? Because you want to do what you can. I mean, you need to make the disclosure. You want to make sure people are aware, but you also don't want to unnecessarily alarm them. You don't want to be clumsy with the way you integrate it into your enrollment process so that you're having to make the disclosure multiple times or it's confusing. In other words, you want to mitigate the damage, right? And the department has even acknowledged in guidance, they said, look, we understand this is potentially damaging, and we expect that institutions will address that by providing certain assurances and working on the context and the delivery method so that it's not more damaging than it needs to be. So the department even understands that schools are going to want to think a little bit about how they package and present these student warnings, and they would expect you to be doing that. The first time you likely would have to do that would be probably late spring is my expectation, spring to late spring of 2017 when the first round of final rates come out, because if you have a program that fails in year 1, you are ostensibly at that point a year out from losing eligibility. So late this year, not right now, but I would say in the fall, winter of 2016, if you think you've got a program that's going to fail, you want to start thinking about these student warnings. All right, so let's really get into the heart of it and talk about projecting rates. We've broken this up into a 9-step process, essentially. We sort of deconstructed the way the rates are calculated by the department. Again, remember, the department is the one calculating these rates, but we wanted to give you a process for calculating the rates and projecting them just like the department's going to do, so that you could try to ballpark where you think your rates are going to come out and determine what type of strategies or remediation might be in order. Step 1 is to understand the scope of your institution. So when an institution is first approved to participate in the Title IV programs, as most of you know, the department, particularly if you're in financial aid, the department assigns each institution a unique 6-digit OPE ID number, right? When the department calculates the debt-to-earning rates, I call them the gainful employment rates sometimes, but when they calculate these debt-to-earning rates, they're going to do so by OPE ID. So the first thing you want to do is make sure you understand if you've got an institution that has multiple locations or multiple brand names, et cetera, you want to make sure you understand how the OPE IDs are divvied up, because each one essentially represents a bucket, right? And the DE rates are going to be calculated within the context of that bucket, that OPE ID. And sometimes this can be a little trickier than one would think. I mean, you could have an institution that to the public appears to be a single institution, right? So we think of it as University X, but within University X, there might be 2 or 3 OPE IDs, and one might have 1 location in it, and one might have 4 locations in it. You know, one might just have the medical school. That happens sometimes. The other thing, conversely, that can happen is you can have a situation where you have one OPEID, but to the public it looks like lots of different schools. So the department considers it a single institution, even though we would look at it and we would say, well, this is University X in California and this is University Y in New York City. But for the department, it's a single institution. So when they calculate gainful employment rates, they'll be looking at both of those locations as being part of the same bucket, and they'll also be grouping their programming together. So it's really important as a starting point, and this isn't a terribly difficult exercise, but it's an important exercise. Pull out your ECAR, make sure you understand, that's your Eligibility Certification Approval Report. The financial aid folks, again, will know what that is. And make sure you understand the locations and programs that are within each OPEID that may be part of your institution. For lots of folks, you'll just have one OPEID, but that is not always the case. Step 2 is identifying the GE program. So for the rest of the presentation, let's just assume we're dealing within a single OPEID. So within that OPEID, you know, you've got one ECAR, Eligibility Certification Approval Report, and you pull it out, and it's going to list your gainful employment programs, right? Because pretty much everybody these days is expected to list, whether you're nonprofit or for-profit, your non-degree programs should be there, and the for-profits these days are typically expected to list their degree programs as well. That sort of went into play in 2011, and most of them went ahead and did it, and now are encouraged to do it by the department. So just about everything should be there. Certainly your non-degree programs should be there. But within your OPEID, you want to figure out what are the Title IV eligible programs that we offer, right? But then you need to go an additional step, because it's important to understand when the department, this idea of a program for the department, when it's calculating DE rates, it defines a program within a given OPEID by two criteria. One is SIP code, that's Classification of Instructional Program Code, and the other is credential level. And that's the only way they have to distinguish one program from another. You may say, well, why don't they use the program name or the length of the program or, you know, any of the other various characteristics, cost, price, et cetera, the location where it's offered? It's because the department doesn't have that information. Remember, when you get a program approved with the department, if you've got more than one location, they don't know which location you're offering the program at. They don't ask for that data. They don't know the price of the program. They're certainly not going to use names, even though some of us will give them names. That can be very unreliable, as you know, and names will differ sometimes from campus to campus or from one regulator to another. Really, the only data the department has that it feels like is reliable is SIP code and credential level, right? So the first thing you want to do when you're trying to figure out, and that's how they're going to determine which GE programs you offer and for which GE programs they're going to be taking debt information and earnings information. So you want to start by dividing all those programs within your OPEID by credential level. And the department recognizes 8 different credential levels. So you want to make sure that when you're divvying things up, you're doing it in accordance with these 8 categories. For most schools, you're going to be looking at undergraduate certificates or diplomas, associate degrees, bachelor's degrees. There are a few for-profits that also offer graduate and professional level programs that would be GE programs. But for the vast majority of institutions, your GE programs are probably going to be again, certificate, associate, or bachelor's. But you need to divide them up with respect to these credentials. And then, after you've done that, within each credential level, divide your programs by SIP code, right? And again, the SIP code is on the ECAR. It's something that's assigned to any Title IV eligible program as soon as it's approved by the department when you first put it on that ECAR. Now, and this is a critical point. Any programs with identical credential levels and SIP codes have to be consolidated. So you say, well, Erin, wait a minute. We've got a campus in LA and a campus in New York, right? And we offer a program in LA and we call it medical assisting with a concentration in X and Y, and it's at a certain price point and it's a certain length. And we offer another program in New York and it's called, you know, medical assistant associate with a concentration in Z, and it's at a totally different price point. I mean, we consider these completely different programs, and they're even listed with different names and links, you know, and hours and all those kinds of things on our ECAR. Doesn't matter, right? When the department does their debt to earnings rate calculations, if it's got the same, if these two programs are both on the ECAR within a single OPEID, and they have the same credential level, right, and the same SIP code, 6-digit SIP code, they're going to be mashed together. And those students in LA and those students in New York are going to be combined when they're talking about their debt and their earnings. That may not make a lot of sense, but again, remember, the department has to do it this way because this is what their data permits them to do. They literally don't have the capability in their systems and they don't have the information they would need to split these things out much further, right? So this is how they've decided to do it, and so what that means is if you're going to try projecting your debt to earnings rates, you need to make sure that you've got your OPIDs categorized correctly and you've got your GE programs grouped correctly as well. Okay, so now we know our OPID and we've got our list of GE programs that we offer. We've got our 4 programs, say, that we offer within that OPID. The next thing you need to do is figure out who are the students that the department's looking at, right? For each of these programs, the department's pulling debt information and earnings information, and they're doing that for some group of students. How do we figure out that group? So for purposes of students, the department, within the context of the new gainful employment regulations, for the purposes of calculating DE rates and really for any other purpose, the department defines a student as any individual who received Title IV funds for enrolling in a GE program. This is different from the old gainful employment framework that was put out in 2011. There it was just any student in a GE program. Now we are only concerned, just as a threshold matter, we are only concerned with students who receive some type of Title IV. Now that could mean a grant. It doesn't mean they have to have any loans. And in fact, if you've got students who got a grant and no loans at all, that's good for you because that debt number is going to be 0 potentially and they will be included, right? But the starting point, the thing to understand is when you're reporting information to the Department for Gainful Employment, when you're projecting rates, you're only concerned with students who got some form of Title IV. Beyond that, all right, when determining students to include in your cohort, and I'm going to start calling it this group our cohort, you want to eliminate any students not only who didn't receive Title IV, so if they got no Title IV, take them out. But the other thing is you want to exclude anyone who satisfies one or more of these following 6 criteria. This is important for projecting rates. It's also going to be important when you think about challenging the department's data down the road, because the department, they're going to send back to you, remember I mentioned the completers list, the first thing you're going to be able to challenge is whether or not the department's got the right group of students for each GE program, right? And they have acknowledged that there are these exclusions, these 6 exclusions, and they may not know in every circumstance whether or not a student fits one of these exclusions. It could be that the student falls into one of these exclusions and the department just is unaware, and that would be an opportunity for you to challenge and get that person removed from the cohort, or alternatively, there might be a reason someone should be in the cohort, right? But to be able to effectively challenge down the road and to be able here to effectively project rates and get the right group of students, you need to understand these 6 exclusions. So the first is if one or more of the students' Title IV loans were in a military-related deferment. Okay, so military-related deferment. The second is if the department is considering or has approved a discharge on the basis of total and permanent disability. The third is if the student's deceased. And the fourth is the student was enrolled in any other eligible program at your school or some other school during the calendar year for which earnings information is being gathered. Now, I wanted to go through all 4 of those because in my mind they sort of fit together, and here's why. What the department is really saying is, look, when we do these calculations, right, we're comparing debt to earnings, and we appreciate that there may be circumstances that could arise, right, and that is, by virtue of those circumstances, these students would not have been earning money, or at least not doing what you prepared them to do and earning a representative salary in the year about which we're concerned. So for the 14-15 rates, the department's going to be looking at what people earned in calendar year 14. And their point is, look, if somebody was in the military in calendar year 14, okay, if they were deceased, if they were permanently disabled, or if they were enrolled in graduate school somewhere or just some other institution or another program at your school, right, if any of those is true, we're going to exclude them from the cohort because we understand they weren't making money and their earnings information isn't representative and shouldn't be included. But again, the department has noted they may not know if somebody was in the military. They certainly may not know if a student was deceased, right? I mean, they might, but they might not. So there could be an opportunity for you to inform the department and in the challenge process and let them know that a student should be excluded. The other 2 here, 5 and 6, also kind of go together. So there's this concept of rolling up debt when the department projects rates. If you had a student, and the department draws a hard line here between undergraduate and graduate programs. So right now I just want to focus on number 5 because for most for-profit schools and for all nonprofit schools, your GE programs are probably going to be at the undergraduate level for the most part, right? So what the department says is if you've got a student that completed a subsequent higher credentialed undergraduate GE program at your institution, so they completed the second program before we got to the point of calculating these rates, right? Then we want to roll up all the debt to the higher credential program, and we're going to exclude them from the cohort of the lower program. So let me give you a concrete example, and we'll do this at the undergraduate level. If you had a student who got a certificate in medical assisting, okay, and then they went on and you had an associate degree medical assisting program, and let's say it was even designed so that these programs stacked, and you have a fair number of students that, you know, they get done with their certificate, they move right into the associate degree program, and then they finished the associate degree program and graduated, you know, back in 2013, right? So before the current award year for which the DE rates are being calculated, 14-15. They completely finished the second program. What the department is saying is we're going to exclude them from the certificate program cohort altogether. They're just going to be excluded. We're only going to include them in the cohort for the associate degree program for those rates are calculated, and we're going to take all the debt that they amassed for both programs, the certificate and the associate degree program, and we're going to attribute it just to the higher credential program, right? So they're just going to roll that debt up to the higher credential program. Now, several points to make. First is they're not taking into account debt that may have been accumulated by the student when they were at another institution. The department reserves the right to do that where you have schools that are under common ownership. But as a rule, that is not the way this works, right? So if they, and that was one of those things back in 2011 that was getting a lot of discussion, but under the current framework, you can forget about the debt. You don't have to go back and try to figure out the debt from a prior institution. You're just concerned about your institution, okay? Remember, it has to be a higher credential program. So let's say they finished that medical assistant certificate program, and then they went and completed your HVAC certificate program. Those are at the same credential level, so there's no debt roll-up, right? There's no debt roll-up. They would just be included in the cohort for each one, for the medical assistant certificate and the HVAC certificate. The other thing to note is it does not matter if the higher credential program is in the same subject area. So let's say, again, they finished the medical assistant certificate program, and then they finished an HVAC associate degree program. It does roll up, because they did finish a higher credential program, and the fact that one was in one subject area and the other was another doesn't matter. Okay. Now, the last example I want to get back to, I did mention earlier that the department draws a hard line between undergraduate and graduate programs. So let's say someone comes to your institution and they complete an associate or a bachelor's degree in something, and then they go on and complete successfully a master's degree program at the graduate level. There's no debt roll-up. They're just in the cohort for the bachelor's degree, and then they are separately included in the cohort for the master's degree, and the debt information is split between those two. Finally, any student who, okay, so just sort of summarizing, any student who received Title IV funds for enrolling in their GE program and who fails to fall in one of those excluded categories, so they're not excluded for one of the 6 reasons we just discussed, that person would be included in your GE program cohort. For each program, those are the students we're concerned with here, and I'm going to call them going forward GE students. Okay, so now you know your OPID. We've got your programs divided up. We know the 4 or 5 programs we know that we offer within the OPID GE programs. We know the type of students we're looking at. Right, so now we need to figure out the time frame, okay? So for each GE program, we need a group of students. We know the kind of student we want, but who are we talking about here in terms of time frame? So the DE rates for each GE program are based on data for students who completed the program during the applicable cohort period. I'm going to tell you what that means. But the first thing to note here is it's just for completers, okay? So for students who withdrew, those students do not go into the DE rate calculation. Now, the department has reserved the right and may down the road decide to do a debt to earnings calculation for folks who were drops, but that won't be part of the DE rate calculation and eligibility process. That would just be something you would have to disclose as part of the disclosures, right? And I talked about that in the last of our 5-part, in the last webinar of our 5-part series. We talk about the new disclosures that go into effect in early January 2017. But for purposes of calculating the DE rates, that will determine continued program eligibility. You are only concerned with students who actually completed your program, okay? So completed the program when? You're looking at students who completed either during a 2-year time frame or a 4-year time frame. Now, there is one exception. If you offer certain types of medical or dental programs that have an extended 6-year residency, there's this extended 6-year cohort. That's pretty unusual. But if you are listening to this and you say, well, wait a minute, we do have a 6-year dental or med program, send me an email or talk to your attorney or your compliance person, because it's possible, be dealing with a 6-year cohort period. But for the vast majority of schools, the rule is you're either dealing with 2 years or 4 years. So how do you know which is which? So the 2-year cohort period is the period covering the 2 consecutive award years that are the 3rd and 4th award years prior to the award year for which your DE rates are calculated. Don't worry, I got a graph coming. The 4-year cohort period is the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th award years prior to the award year for which your DE rates are calculated. So picture's worth 1,000 words. The first year, the department is calculating rates for the 14-15 award year. If you look at this graphic, what you can see is, so for the first year, the 2-year cohort period is 10, 11, 11, 12. So when the department is calculating these rates, they are going to be looking at the debt information and earnings information for students who completed your GE program in 10, 11, 11, 12. That's it, right? But as we go forward, I wanted you to understand the relationship. So you know, 5 years from now, you would understand how to calculate what the 2-year window is going to be in the 4-year window. The 4-year cohort period is just an extended version. So 2-year cohort period is 10, 11, 11, 12, and the 4-year is 8, 9, 9, 10, 10, 11, 11, 12. Well, how do you know whether to use the 2-year or the 4-year? So you use a 2-year cohort period when the number of GE students completing your GE program is 30 or more. Okay, so if you've got at least 30 or more students in the 2-year cohort, that's what the department's going to use. You know, say you had 45 people graduate in 10, 11, 11, 12 from your HVAC program, that's the cohort they're going to use. Those are the students they're going to be concerned with. And remember, we're talking about GE students, so we're talking about folks who got Title IV, right? So if you only had 10 people who got some form of Title IV, you would not actually have the 30 GE students, right? So do keep that in mind. So what happens if that's the case? What happens if you only had 10 completers in 10, 11, 11, 12, GE students who completed? Well, that's when the department expands. So they say, okay, we're going to go back 2 more years so we can get a larger sample size, because, again, we feel like we need to at least have 30 GE students, okay? So what happens if the department expands the cohort and it looks at all the GE students who completed your program between 8, 9, and 11, 12 over that 4-year award period, and they still don't have at least 30? If the expanded 4-year cohort does not have 30 qualifying GE students that completed the program during that period, then the department will not calculate DE rates for the program for the applicable award years. So they're just not going to calculate a rate for you. That does not mean you passed, right? Now, it also doesn't mean you failed. It means the department's going to give you what they call a no result, okay? The significance of calling it a no result and not calling it a pass is, remember, you lose eligibility. Remember, you lose eligibility if you fail 2 out of any 3 consecutive award years for which rates were calculated, okay? So if you get a no result, it's like that year didn't exist. It's like it vanished. And let me give you a concrete example. So let's say you fail in year 1 and you pass in year 2. And then you have in year 3 a no result because you didn't have at least 30 students in that expanded 4-year cohort. And then in year 4 you fail again. Then you would become ineligible, right? Because from the department's standpoint, the year 3 was like it vanished. It was a no result, and you failed 2 out of 3 consecutive award years for which rates were calculated. So even though your fail were ostensibly 3 years apart, right, in year 1 and year 4, because you had a no result in there, right, then you would have failed 2 out of 3 consecutive award years. This is an important principle to understand if you're trying to track, right, and understand when you might become ineligible. The other thing to remember is if, for example, you fail and you are having to make student warnings, a no result will not get you out of that, right? Because, again, from the department's perspective, even if you have a no result, you are still ostensibly a year out from losing eligibility, assuming you had failed in year 1. All right. So again, it's as if that year vanishes when you're trying to do these calculations. Now, one thing the department does say is, look, if you have a result for more than 4 consecutive years, a no result for more than 4 consecutive years, we'll start to kick out the old data, because we appreciate that there comes a point where it's just so old that if you've got a ton of no results in a row, it would not be fair to associate data from, 1990 with data from 2001 and consider those consecutive award years, right? So if it's more than 4 years old, they just boot it. Okay. Transitional rates. So this whole time we've said, okay, the department's going to calculate 2 rates for each GE program. They're going to calculate the annual earnings rate and a discretionary income rate. For a limited period, for any GE program that is deemed failing or in the zone under the standard calculations, the department will also calculate a transitional rate. So ostensibly that means you will get 4 rates for your GE program. You'll get the AER and DIR calculated using the standard methodology, right? And if after they look at those you're failing or in the zone, then they will calculate an AER and DIR using the transitional rate methodology. The transitional rates are calculated using the exact same process. The only difference is the department is looking at a different group of students when they pull the debt information. So remember, under the standard methodology, we just talked it through and we said the department, for most programs, assuming you have at least 30 students, they're going to be looking at folks who completed your program in 10, 11, 11, 12. For the transitional rates, the department's going to look at folks who graduated or completed your program in the most recent award year, which would be 14, 15. Right, for the 14-15 when they do the 14-15 rates. Well, why would they do that? Because this is the department's conceit that even when these regulations were first promulgated, you know, when we first saw the first copy of the finals in October, late October of 2014, the 14-15 award year was underway. And by the time the regulations became effective, July 1, 2015, the 14-15 award year was done. And certainly there was nothing you could do about what you charged or the debt that was taken on by students who completed way back in 10, 11, 11, 12. For that matter, there won't be anything you can do about the debt associated with your students in the traditional cohort for several more years, right? If you cut your prices today, as of 2016, it would still be several years before you're looking at the debt associated with students who graduated in 14-15 and 15-16, right? So the department is saying, okay, we understand that it's not fair to institutions, to some extent they are saying they understand, not to give them any way to benefit from changes they might make in the near term. In other words, if somebody says, okay, we want to be a good actor, we want to do exactly what the department says, we're going to slash our prices in 2, it's not fair that this institution might still lose its program eligibility, despite the fact that it's taken these dramatic steps. There ought to be some way that that action comes into play. And that's what the transitional rate is designed to do. It's designed to somehow capture activity efforts by the institution made subsequent to these regulations coming out in more recent award years, right? So the department would calculate these transitional rates, and if the transitional rates are better, then they'll take the transitional rates, right? So you get the better of the 2. So as long as you can pass under your transitional rates, you would be okay. What I suggest is, look, if you project these rates, and your rates projected under the standard methodology are failing or in the zone, you ought to go ahead and project transitional rates too and see how those are going to be. And remember, that's the transitional rates you're going to have the best chance of impacting in the near term over the next 2 or 3 years, right? So you'll want to have a sense as to where those are going to come out too. A couple of important notes. One is, if the department has said, I'm not sure where the support for this is in the law, but this is their current position, they've said if your transitional cohort has fewer than 30 students, they're not going to calculate a transitional rate for you. So that means if you're failing or in the zone when they calculate under the traditional methodology, so they've looked at 10, 11, 11, 12, let's say you had 40 students that completed in 10, 11, 11, 12 and your program's failing, they said, okay, we're going to calculate transitional rates for you. Oh, but in 14, 15, you only had 28 students that completed. Then they're not going to calculate a transitional rate. Again, I'm not sure I see the support for that in the law, but that is their current position. My expectation is this may be one of the things that really gets challenged and where there's some serious pushback, among others, in the coming years. The other thing that I wanted to note, if you think this through, it may have occurred to you that when the department calculates their transitional rates, if they're taking the debt information for students who completed in the most recent award year, 14-15, where are they getting the earnings information? Because the folks who completed in 14-15 obviously weren't making any money in calendar year 14. They hadn't even graduated from your program yet, at least not doing what you're preparing them to do. Well, the department's still going to take the earnings information from the traditional cohort. So what you're going to have is when they calculate the transitional rates, you're going to have debt information associated with students who completed in 14-15 as compared to earnings information for students who completed in 10, 11, 11, 12. couple of reasons that's significant. I mean, one is just to understand that there's this discord between the two cohort groups, but the other thing is to keep in mind that even if you're banking on your transitional rates, it's still really important to pay attention to that completers list the department sends you to make sure that you are getting on that list anyone who you think went out and is making good money, right? I mean, you want to make sure you're including all those people because the folks who graduated in 10, 11, 11, 12, or through, you know, in the four-year cohort under the traditional methodology, those are still the people for whom the department is pulling earnings information. So you just want to make sure that you're giving that thought. Don't assume if the transitional rates are, if you're saying, well, you know, we're going to really rely on our transitional rates, please still take a good hard look at the completers list that the department sends you. Okay, here's just a graph to give you a sense. I mentioned that the department won't calculate transitional rates forever. They will be phased out. Even from the get-go, well, I guess in year one for 14, 15, everyone will get it. But you'll see that how long they will calculate a transitional rate for you depends on how long your program goes. So you'll see the period for programs that are 1 year or less, they'll do the transitional rates out through 18, 19, and then they give you an extra year if you're a program between 1 and 2 years, and another extra year if you're a program of more than 2 years. Okay, step 5. So at this point, hopefully, you know your OPID. We figured out our GE programs. For each program, we now know the students we're concerned with, right? So that's the folks who completed in 10, 11, 11, 12, or between 8, 9, 9, 10, 10, 11, 11, 12 in that period, depending on whether you needed to expand to a four-year cohort, right? So maybe at this point you've got a spreadsheet, okay? And that spreadsheet, each page within that, you know, you've got a workbook, I guess, if we're talking about Excel, and maybe each spreadsheet within the workbook represents one of your GE programs. If you click on it, you're looking at a list of students, right? So what we're essentially going to do next is we're going to figure out what is the debt that the department is going to be associating with each one of those students. You know, each row represents one student. The first thing that's really important to understand is, though the department refers generally when they're talking about DE rates to the debt, right, for each student, they're actually going to be looking at two numbers. They're going to be looking at the cost you assess that student and the debt the student took on in connection with their enrollment in your program, right? And then they're going to be taking the lesser of those two numbers. The other really important thing to understand is that can be different for each student, right? So think about it. You've got a GE program, and let's say most of your students borrow the maximum amount. So you charge $10,000 for your program, and most of your students are borrowing in the neighborhood of 12 or 13 or 14,000, okay? For those students, if you've got, imagine that spreadsheet, and in the first column, again, you've got all your students listed, okay? In the next column, you have the cost that you assessed each one of those students. So what did you charge them? In the third column, you've got the debt amount. So what did they take on in the way of debt, okay? The fourth column on each row is going to be the lesser of the cost or the debt for each student. So if you've got that common typical student we talked about where you charged them $10,000 and they took out $13,000 or $14,000 in loans, in the fourth column you're going to have the $10,000 because that's the lesser of the two numbers. But let's say you've got another student who had other means and they took out a Pell Grant, so they're a Title IV student, they're appropriately included here in the cohort, right? You charged them $10,000 because that's the cost of the program, but they didn't take out any loan debt whatsoever, right? They paid cash out of pocket. So the loan column's a 0. Well, for that student, your fourth column is going to be a 0, right? Because you charged them $10,000 and they had no loan debt. So you can see for the first student and the second student, we took different numbers. For the first student, we took the $10,000 because that was the lesser of the two. And then for the second student, right, we took the 0, right, because that was the lesser of the two. Finally, what you're going to do when you have those numbers figured out for all the students in the cohort, you're going to take the median of the fourth column. And that's how you get the median debt number for the program, okay? So when calculating a student's actual loan debt, so of course, before you can do that calculation on the fourth column, you have to figure out what was the cost assessed and what was the debt number, right? Those are the numbers in columns 2 and column 3, respectively, in our imaginary spreadsheet. When calculating a student's actual loan debt, so that was the information I said was in column 3 for our little spreadsheet, you're going to need to include any debt that falls into one of 3 categories. And this is really important to understand where this data comes from. In the second webinar in our 5-part series, I talked about strategies for improving these rates. Many of the opportunities available to you are going to involve understanding how the debt and cost numbers are calculated, the data that goes into those, and figuring out ways that you could impact that data and reduce those numbers so that your cost or debt comes down, right? So debt is a combination of 3 numbers. The first, any Title IV loans that the student borrowed. So that's the total amount dispersed less any cancellations or adjustments. So importantly, that is a net number, okay? If they got Title IV and then some of it got sent back, what got sent back gets netted out. But it's any Title IV that the student borrowed and, you know, where there was no subsequent cancellation or judgment for enrollment in your GE program, okay? But this excludes federal PLUS loans made to parents of dependent students or direct PLUS loans made to parents of dependent students, and direct unsubsidized loans that were converted from Teach Grants. The Teach Grants probably ain't going to be real meaningful to a lot of people. The PLUS loans point is meaningful because one thing to keep in mind, and this is one of those strategies that I talk about in the second webinar in the series, if you can get your students to fund their programming by getting their parents to take out PLUS loans, that debt does not get included in your DE rate calculation because, as we see right here, it is not included in the actual debt number for each student, right? So encouraging PLUS loan borrowing in lieu of students taking out debt in the way of direct loans is one way to try to impact your debt numbers. Okay. In addition to Title IV loans, any private education loan, including private education loans made by the institution that the student borrowed for enrollment in the program, and that would include, if you're familiar with the definition of a private education loan, that would include an institutional payment plan, even if it's no interest, if it's over 12 months. If it's less than a year and there's no interest, it's not a private education loan. But if it's more than a year, right, even if there's no interest, if it's more than a year, the term of the instrument, it's a private education loan, and that gets included in this. The principal of that amount the loan gets included in the debt number. Finally, any amount outstanding as of the date the student completes the program. Okay, so if you have a payment plan that's not a private education loan, so let's say it's over 6 months, and that just goes on the ledger, the amount owed, that gets rolled in, and any other amount, if you had charges relating to their participation in the program, so that could be lab fees, library fees, things like that, all of that gets put on the ledger. Anything that they still owe the institution for enrollment in their program and that's sitting on the ledger when they complete the program, that becomes this institutional debt, and it also gets rolled into this debt number along with Title IV and along with private education loans. The total cost for each student, remember this is what's in our second imaginary column, right? So total cost for each student comes from 2 different places. The first is tuition and fees. You assess the student. Now I want to emphasize, this is the amount, this isn't what's sitting in your catalog as the cost of the program. It's not necessarily the cost that's sitting on the enrollment agreement if you've got an enrollment agreement. And it is not, and this is really important, it is not a net number. It's what you actually assess the student for the program on the ledger. So if you charge the student $10,000, even if you subsequently gave them a $2,000 scholarship, you report the $10,000 to the department because that's what you assessed. And this gets to one of our strategies we talk about too, and that is reducing the program cost. That can benefit you, but just make sure that you are reducing the actual amount you assess the student, and you're not trying to net it out. You don't assess, if you assess someone $10,000 and the cost of the program is $10,000 and then you give them a $2,000 write-down or scholarship, that is not going to improve the cost number for purposes of gainful employment because the department is still going to get the $10,000, right? If you want to reduce cost assessed, you actually have to assess the student less from the get-go, which means lowering the cost of the program. The second component is the allowance for books, supplies, and equipment included in the student's Title IV cost of attendance, or a higher amount if assessed the student by the institution. So everybody's got that cost of attendance amount that they use for purposes of packaging financial aid. That gets tacked on to tuition and fees, whatever it is that your institution is calculated as the cost of attendance for that particular program. But if you actually assess the student a higher amount for those items that go into cost of attendance, you would have to go with the higher amount. Just keep that in mind. Rolling up debt. So again, we talked about this in the context earlier of exclusions, but when you are trying to determine for each of your programs the cost and debt number, just remember there is this roll-up exercise. So again, if you had someone who was in your medical assisting certificate program and then they completed a medical assisting associate degree program before the point at which these rates were calculated, so again, let's say they finished the associate degree program in 2013, then you need to attribute all of the cost or all of the debt to the associate degree program, and you want to include that student in the cohort for the associate degree program, and you would exclude them entirely from the certificate program. The median, and this is the easiest of the steps, I think, step 6. The median is a set of values that's in the middle value. So remember we said, now you've gone through this exercise, you've got your spreadsheet, you've got your list of students, you've figured out the cost and debt for each student, and then in your last column you figured out the lesser of those two for each student. So now you got a column full of numbers and you just need to figure out the median. So the median's the middle value. To determine the median loan debt, you place all those loan debt numbers in value order, and then you just identify the middle number. In instances where a cohort includes an even number of students, so let's say you got 12 students, you would identify the middle pair of numbers and calculate the value that would be halfway between them. So in that case, you'd be taking the average of those or the mean of those two middle numbers. But if you're like me, so here's an example, the median illustration. So you see we've got all our students listed, and then I don't have the two in between columns. I'm basically showing you the fourth column in our imaginary spreadsheet. So that's showing you the debt or cost number for each student, and then you can see 11,064 is the median. What I was going to say a second ago is if you're like me, you probably use Excel, and most other similar type software programs are going to have some sort of function that will calculate the median for you. And here I've got listed on the slide, this is the Excel function to calculate the median. Okay, step 7. So once you've got that median loan debt for each program, the last thing you need to do is you need to figure out the annual loan payment. And the way you do that is you amortize the median loan debt. And there are a couple, 3 things that go into amortization, and the department tells you how to do this in the regulations. The first thing to understand is when you amortize, you have to choose a repayment period, and that's going to differ depending on the length of your program. Or really, I take that back, not the length, but the credential level of your program. So, and here on this slide, you see if it's you use a 10-year repayment period, if it's a certificate, post-baccalaureate certificate, associate degree, or graduate certificate. And this associates basically with the average length of the program. 15 years if it's a bachelor's degree, master's degree, 20 years if it's a doctoral or first professional degree. So for all the nonprofits and for most for-profits that have GE programs that are basically at the certificate or the associate degree level, you're going to have a 10-year repayment period. But there will be some for-profits that have higher level programming where they'll need to use a 15 or 20-year repayment period. The applicable interest rate is going to vary. When you're amortizing over the years going forward, the interest rate will vary because it's calculated. You figure out the right interest rate to use using past loan rates. And it also takes into account the length and type of your program, among other things. Here's the good news. Because the interest rate for all undergraduate, graduate, and professional level direct unsubsidized loans, so all of them, first dispersed between July 106 and June 30, 2013 was fixed at 6.8%. That 6.8% is the interest rate you would use for projecting your GE rates for every program, every type of program for this first 14-15 award year. Okay. Now that's not always going to be the case. In future years, we're going to have to recalculate the interest rate, and it's going to start to change. But because during this period, 06 to 13, it was fixed, the outcome, even when you apply this formula for every kind of program, is just the 6.8. With median loan debt, so now that you know your median loan debt, remember that's what we figured out through our first 6 steps, and you know your annual interest rate, that's 6.8%, and you know your repayment period. For almost every program, we said that's going to be, for most GE programs, that's going to be 10 years, right, because that's all the certificate and associate degree programs and graduate certificate programs. Once you have those 3 pieces of data, you can calculate the annual loan payment. And the annual loan payment, remember, is the numerator for both of these rates, the annual earnings rate and the discretionary income rate. We're actually going to determine a monthly loan payment first, and then we'll multiply that times 12 to get the annual loan payment. And the reason we're going to calculate the monthly loan payment is because that's how students pay their loans back, monthly. They don't pay it on an annual basis. Here, for the mathematically inclined, is the formula, the amortization formula, and you see out to the left, A equals your monthly loan payment, P is your median loan debt for the GE program, R is the monthly interest rate, N is the total number of monthly payments. But again, if you're like me, you'd much rather do this using Excel. So here's the formula. You can plug this into the cell in Excel, and then all you need to do is put in the D, the I, and the Y, which I just realized could stand for do it yourself. So the D is median loan debt for the GE program, remember, and we already calculated that. I is the annual interest rate, that's going to be 6.8%, and Y is the number of years for repayment. So plug this into your spreadsheet, figure out the D, the I, and the Y, put those in, and it will spit out for you the numerator for each of your rates, the DIR and the AER. All right, and there they are again, just as a reminder. So now that we figured out the numerator, which, by the way, is the vast majority of this presentation, so we're getting close to being done. Now you need to figure out your annual earnings number, and then, as I mentioned earlier, you can do a slight calculation once you've got that and come up with your discretionary income. When determining annual earnings for GE program, the department's going to obtain from Social Security Administration the most currently available mean and median annual earnings for the GE students in your cohort. So what they're going to do is they're going to take that completers list. Remember, we said you're going to have a chance to challenge that, and there will be some back and forth, but eventually they're going to say, okay, now we've got the final list of the students that completed in the applicable cohort period for this GE program, and they're going to send over to Social Security the name, date of birth, and Social Security number for each one of those students, okay? And Social Security Administration is going to pull the earnings information they've got in their systems for that list of students, and then they're going to calculate the mean and median. And they're going to send back to the department the mean and median earnings for the whole cohort. So, you know, I don't want to sound naive, but at least in the way the law works and the way it's supposed to work, the department will not have the earnings information for each individual student. They will get back from SSA the mean and the median for the cohort, right? And then the department will use the higher of the mean or the median for purposes of the DE rate calculation. So in that sense, the institution gets the benefit. When computing the 14-15 rates, the department is going to use earnings data from calendar year 2014. Now, interestingly enough, because they've been so delayed, technically the most recently available earnings information is now from 2015, but the department has said, you know, we're going to stick with calendar year 14 when we do the first round rates. Because the SSA data is not available to the public, when you do your projections, you're going to have to develop a proxy for SSA earnings information. In other words, you're not going to have the data that the SSA sends back from the department, not until the draft rates are published, you know, and even then only 1 year at a time. So if you're looking to project rates out for years to come, or if you want to roll out new programs and figure out if you think they're going to have good rates, you're going to have to project a denominator, right, for each program's equation. I would suggest getting that from lots of different places. I don't think there's any one source right now that I'm aware of that would provide what I would consider definitive earnings information. So I would look at actual salary data obtained through graduate surveys if you have those. If you don't, you will probably want to start doing them soon. And in fact, the alternative earnings survey is one of the challenge options that institutions will have. So my expectation is a lot of schools will start to implement an annual earnings survey, but for lots of different reasons, for projecting rates so that they'll have the data in the event they want to challenge earnings, et cetera. Feedback from regional employers regarding salary practices. So one thing you can do, if you have a lot of employers or only a handful of employers you deal with, it really doesn't matter. If you can reach out to some of them and say, look, what were you paying our students in 2014? Do you recall? Do you know what they made? Can you ballpark that for me? That would be a great way to get a sense as to the real salaries. And that works particularly if you're a smaller school and your graduates are pretty local and don't tend to go off all over the place. Feedback from faculty, staff, program advisory committees, if you've got a PAC, and experienced career services personnel. So I think polling those guys and saying, look, what do we think people are making, or what were they making in 2014, more importantly. A couple other things. I mean, you can use the estimated data that was included with the department's 2012 GE informational rates. So when they were first gearing up to put out the 2014 Gainful Employment Regulations. One of the things they did is they said, well, you know, we think it's going to work like this. We think we'll pull information from Social Security, and they did a dry run. They actually sent to Social Security lists of students for programs at institutions throughout the U.S. that participate in Title IV and got this mean and median earnings information. The specific cohort, so they asked for information for GE students who completed between October 1st, 2007 and September 30th, 2009, and they asked SSA to tell them what did these folks make in calendar year 2011. Now, a lot of people have criticized this data, and there's no doubt that it is not perfect. I mean, it's got a lot of problems. There are a lot of schools have looked at it and said, well, we got programs that aren't represented, and the salary data seems very low. The other thing to remember is, you know, you're looking at what people made in 2011. So that was several years ago, much closer to the recession, right? So rates, earnings may have just been down as a general matter. And then there are a lot of schools that didn't have programs back then. Maybe you didn't even launch your program until after 2009, so you wouldn't have any completers that they would have been part of this exercise. But all of that having been said, this spreadsheet that the department has created, it's available on their website at the link that's on this page. This spreadsheet includes columns that for state, zip code, industry sector, SIP code, and what that means is you can sort it. So even if your school's not there, for example, what you could do, though, is you could say, I want to see the average earnings for all the schools that had a certificate-level cosmetology program in my state. And then you could take that average earnings information, and that's probably better data. Or because it gives you zip code, let's say you're in Memphis, and you want to see, you know, and statewide data for Arkansas and Mississippi and Missouri and Tennessee might be a little much, but what you could do is say, okay, well, what do we think are the zip codes around the Memphis metropolitan area where most of our graduates are going? Right, and would be working, and then you can filter the chart and pull the earnings information for cosmetology programs at schools in those zip codes, right? And then you can average that, and in that way you might actually be able to get to a pretty good number. Now it's still 2011 calendar year earnings, so you may still want to make adjustments for inflation and that kind of thing. But I would pull the data, I would manipulate it, I would see what you get, and then I would take that into account along with data you got from those other various sources that we mentioned earlier. The last place you could look, or first if you like, but another place you could look is BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics. You know, they have a very large website they maintain that has salary and other information for lots of different occupations. But it's typically at best, there are state-level sort of equivalents. They may have state-level data. Typically, it's national, or if you go to the state level, at best, it's statewide. And it's hard to know sometimes what various occupations, how they're being grouped together. I just think I would really take this data with a grain of salt. Again, just consider it another data point to add to your others. I will tell you, in the preamble to the final regulations, the department actually spent 3 columns on one page just talking about why BLS earnings data was not a good thing to use and not representative. And I tend to agree with them on that point. So at best, I would just consider this one of several resources. I certainly would not hang my hat at this point on BLS data because there's probably better data available. And remember, I mean, the quality of your earnings estimate it's half of the equation. So you want to do the best you can to come up with something that you think is accurate. For each GE program, this is the last step, right, discretionary income. So we're talking about calculating the denominator for the discretionary income rate. For each GE program, discretionary income, which is that denominator in the calculation, is calculated by subtracting from a program's annual earnings. So you've already figured out the annual earnings. That's the denominator for the annual earnings rate. So you got the annual earnings you want to go with. You're going to subtract from that 150% of the poverty guideline for a single person residing in the continental United States as published by the Department of Health and Human Services. Really, there's just a website. HHS has a website, and every year they update and they say, this is the poverty guideline for a single person, this is the poverty guideline for a household with 2 people, et cetera. It's just a dollar number, right? So you're going to take that dollar number and multiply it by 1.5, and then you're going to subtract that amount from your annual earnings number, and that's your discretionary income rate. That's your denominator for the second equation. So here's an example. So the 2015 poverty guideline for a single person in the U.S. is $11,770, right? So if you know your annual earnings for your program is $28,000, then to calculate the denominator for the second rate, your discretionary income, you're just going to say 28,000 minus 11,770 times 1.5, and 10,345, which is the answer. That's your discretionary income rate, or the denominator for your second rate. You know, a lot of the clients I work with, and I've done this for folks, we just build these spreadsheets and you put this equation in. So once you plug in your annual earnings, it's automatically going to calculate a discretionary income rate. The denominator is going to calculate discretionary income and go ahead and calculate that rate for you. It's all just automated in the spreadsheet. So this is a consolidated graphic. You'll see consolidated GE timetable. The way it works, and this is kind of taking all the data we discussed earlier and putting it together. Let's just focus first on this first column. So let's say you want to go through this exercise of projecting rates for the 14-15 award year, right? So the 2-year cohort is 10, 11, 11, 12. The 4-year cohort would be 8, 9, 9, 10, 10, 11, 11, 12. That's the second row. The transitional cohort would be for 14-15. Then you see how long they're going to calculate transitional rates for you. Okay. Then you've got earnings data, and that's going to be from calendar year 14. That's the next row. Then you can see the dates that you submitted the data that the department's using. And then finally, we've got a little row here that says final rates released, and we would expect those final rates to be released in early 2017. As of right now, although as I mentioned, that may get pushed back significantly. So we'll just have to see what happens. Finally, GE resources. The department, of course, has its Gainful Employment webpage on the IFAP website, and all of these links are available on that main website, but I wanted to break them out so you could see they've got Federal Register notices, Dear Colleague letters, frequently asked questions, et cetera. All of this relates specifically to gainful employment. It's a lot to wade through, but I want to make sure that you know where the resources are located. We've also got our resources. The first is our GE Desk Guide, and this desk guide was prepared specifically as a complement to this presentation. We prepared it actually about 16 months ago. We've updated it since then, and it walks through the 9 steps that we've talked about today in great detail. So if we're posting a copy on our website, it should be located right alongside the recording of this webinar. If for some reason you can't find it, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to send you a copy. I mean, it is free, and it is a resource. You can sit there and put it out on your desk and walk through these 9 steps, and it gives you additional detail, has all the same charts, et cetera. It was designed to be a tool to help schools go through this process. This, of course, is our little logo here for this webinar series. And again, we're going to post, these are the 5. We're going to create a single page where all of these are located. And if you're listening to this, presumably you found it. Finally, we also have a higher education law and policy blog that we do. It's called Regulation, where we write about various topics, including gainful employment. So if you are interested, by all means, please follow. And finally, if you have not already done so, if you're watching this live, if you will download the PDF of the slides, it should have live links in it. So the link you see right now, for example, if you pull up the PDF and click on it, it should pull up our Regulation blog right there in your browser. This is my contact information. Again, I'm Erin Lacey, and I'm here in the higher education practice of Thompson Coburn, and very much appreciate you listening in. Hope this has been helpful to you, and hope if you have time that you'll listen to some of the others in the webinar series. Thanks so much. Have a great day.